And Jeff, coming back to what you were saying about, swimming against the tide, which is essentially what you're trying to do when you're changing something from within the system. Um,
Yeah.
I would just remember having this conversation with a colleague of mine when we went for a walk one day, who was a peer, and he was going through a HR kind of process. And he said to me, it's really confusing for me. I'm told to bring my whole self to work. And yet here I am in this process where they're trying to knock the edges off me so I can become this thing. And, that was
Hmm.
probably about 5 years ago. And I'm sure that person won't remember saying it, but it was really impactful for me. I thought, wow, that's a really interesting point. We, hire people and we say, bring your full color to work. Everything we want to leverage that beautiful diversity and that, we want you to feel like you belong. But if you could just change yourself a little bit, and if you could just like, mold yourself a little bit into our culture, because you're not a cultural fit, or if you could just behave the way we expect you to behave, or if you could just perform the way we want you to perform and chip away at the edges around you, it is almost quite polar opposite. It's quite binary, really, to say one thing and do the other.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a bit of friction in that before we see any progress.
Hmm. You just on something really interesting there. Just this notion of like, because obviously diversity is such a big topic in the world today as well. But to me, it's the inclusion part of it that's really more important. It's like, when you bring these people into the organization, kind of building on a little bit of what Antoinette talked about earlier. Are you really going to unleash kind of like the potential that's latent within them, or are you just going to keep them in their little box as you've just kind of described there? And that's that, in some ways, I wonder if that's something that maybe a lot of organizations haven't really come to grips with in terms of how they think about D&I. They're very good on the D part. They're less good on the I part, maybe. Um,
I might
yeah.
argue against that, but yeah.
Yeah.
I think that it's really easy when you have call centers and distribution centers that are where all your diversity lies. There's no inclusion. And to really have, true diversity,
Yeah.
you have to have inclusion first. And that's at all levels throughout organizations. And that's where you get the diversity of experience and thought and perspective. So I would argue that many of these large corporations we're talking about, kind of put their diversity into the lowest paying ranks of their organizations, where it's the largest group of employees that they have. That might be a different topic. I could certainly talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you think about what Antoinette was just saying earlier on about, the feminine and the male archetype at play, that if you were to just ignore the diversity and just promote the inclusion, because it's not really about gender diversity, is it? It's about that synergist, it's about balance. If you were to just genuinely focus on inclusion rather than diversity, or rather than leading with diversity, I think is what you were saying. I wonder, would that kind of have more of an impact?
For me, it seems to be there's stages here, because at the moment we're still talking about diversity, which is physical, male, female, straight, bisexual, whatever. And there are still huge issues just on those physical dimensions, because, men still rule the world. Most people need to be straight to keep their jobs, that sort of thing. You need to be white rather than black, or the token black in a really senior role to cover the bases or cover the metrics. So we're still playing with the game on the physical dimension, and yet it's our inner diversity that actually enables us to understand each other as human beings and enables us to become whole when we start to realize things like transference and psychodynamics and that sort of thing, to really understand our shadow and who we're becoming and who we're able to become, because we're in a masterpiece in progress type thing as we evolve vertically through consciousness. So we're still a long way off what I would consider inner diversity, and therefore full inclusion, because if we don't include others, we can't become whole ourselves. if we don't really understand others and realize what they're teaching us in every single conversation, we're not learning as a human being and evolving. So it's a different, and I realize that this is not a typical conversation in the workplace, which is where, we're coming from there, Jeff, in terms of organizations are still struggling with how to work with this, because when we're coming from a parental angle, I think, largely, of still controlling and ensuring that people are doing things right, rather than trusting that if we liberate them, they will do everything possible to realize their potential and realize, wonderful aspirations that they're fully aligned with. So I think we need to, this is again taking the lid off, but to enable people to come into their full selves, we need to start to speak to who they fully could become. Yeah. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic, because I'm a woman and men still run the world. And I've been very frustrated over many years with that situation. And I've always thought, well, I'm sure we'll keep the balance there. But, I'm 60 now, and the balance still is nowhere near where it needs to be. And I grew up in New Zealand, where when I was 20, the six of the most senior people in the country were all women. So I thought that's what life was. When I started to travel, it was completely different. So, we've got to make progress, I think, on physical, on inner dimensions, on holistic, and how organizations need to be the vehicle for our fulfillment, for leading meaningful lives, rather than be resources that enable them to realize their objectives. So there's lots of things to do here, I think.